Pull the trigger. Right now. Do it. The words didn't come as a shout. They came as a cold command, each syllable dropping like a stone into still water, heavy and deliberate. The voice belonged to Brigadier General Harrison Pierce, and it cut through the afternoon air of Fort Ridgemont with the kind of authority that had spent 30 years perfecting the art of intimidation. Around him, spread across the military training complex in Nevada, stood nearly 2,000 personnel. Soldiers, medics, engineers, support staff, all frozen in a collective moment of disbelief. The sky above was a harsh, unforgiving blue, and the desert heat shimmered off the tarmac in waves that made everything look slightly unreal, as if what was about to unfold might be nothing more than a mirage. But it wasn't a mirage. It was happening. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Brigadier General Pierce stood at the center of a live-fire exercise, a massive operation designed to test the readiness and coordination of his entire battalion under simulated combat conditions. The exercise had been running smoothly for hours, a carefully choreographed dance of precision and protocol. But something had gone wrong, or rather, something had gone right depending on how you looked at it. And that was the problem. Standing roughly 30 meters away from the general, with the desert stretching out behind her like an endless canvas of dust and rock, was Captain Dr. Adrienne Hartwell. She was a trauma surgeon and the chief medical officer of the 847th Combat Support Battalion. At 42 years old, with 14 years of active duty and 3 combat deployments to her name, she had earned a reputation that preceded her, not just as a skilled physician, but as someone who could think clearly under pressure, who could read a room, and most importantly, who understood that protocols existed for a reason. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight regulation bun. Her uniform was pressed with military precision. And right now, her face was calm, unnaturally calm. The exercise that afternoon had been designed to simulate a mass casualty scenario, the kind of chaos that happens when things go catastrophically wrong in a combat zone. Soldiers were playing wounded. Medical teams were triage and treating. The entire operation was being filmed for after-action review, documented by multiple camera crews positioned at strategic points across the training ground. Everything was being recorded. Everything was being watched. For the first 3 hours, everything had gone according to plan. But then Captain Hartwell had noticed something. A small detail. The kind of detail that most people would miss, that most people wouldn't think twice about. She was standing near the simulated forward operating base, a hastily constructed medical tent filled with mannequins representing injured personnel, when she observed the exercise coordinators setting up the next phase. They were positioning a live helicopter to land in the casualty evacuation zone. Standard procedure. Routine. Except the wind patterns that afternoon were creating dangerous vortices near the landing zone. The dust being kicked up wasn't settling. The visibility was deteriorating. And most critically, the perimeter safety markers had been placed too close to where the rotor wash would create maximum turbulence. She had seen this exact scenario before. In Kandahar, in 2019, a miscalculated landing zone had resulted in a rotor blade striking a medical tent. 3 people had died. 2 others had been permanently disabled. Captain Hartwell had been there. She had held the hand of a 19-year-old soldier as he realized his legs would never work again. So when she saw the same dangerous setup unfolding at Fort Ridgemont, she didn't hesitate. She didn't think about rank or protocol or politics. She thought about saving lives. She walked directly to the exercise coordinator, a junior officer named Lieutenant Commander Walsh, and quietly, respectfully pointed out the safety concern. She used data. She used her experience. She explained, calmly and clearly, why the landing zone needed to be repositioned, why the wind patterns were creating a hazard, and why they needed to halt this phase of the exercise until adjustments could be made. Lieutenant Commander Walsh had listened. He had nodded. He had actually agreed with her assessment. And he had started to walk toward Brigadier General Pierce to report the safety concern. That's when everything changed. Brigadier General Harrison Pierce did not like being corrected. More specifically, he did not like being corrected by a woman. He did not like the idea that a trauma surgeon, someone he saw as support staff, as secondary to the real military operations, would interrupt his exercise. He did not appreciate the implication that his planning had a flaw, and he absolutely could not tolerate the image of his authority being questioned in front of 2,000 troops. He had strode toward Captain Hartwell with the deliberate, aggressive pace of a man who was about to make a point. His face had turned a deep shade of red. His jaw had clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out like cords beneath his skin. And when he reached her, standing just 2 meters away, he had begun to speak. His words were cutting. They questioned her competence. They suggested she was out of line. They implied that perhaps she didn't belong in a command structure at all. He called her reckless. He called her insubordinate. He said she was trying to undermine his authority in front of the entire battalion. And Captain Adrian Hartwell had simply stood there, listening, her hands at her sides, her breathing steady, her eyes forward. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She didn't raise her voice. She simply waited. That was when Brigadier General Pierce made his decision. His hand moved to his service weapon, the M9 Beretta at his hip. In one fluid motion, he drew it. The gasps that rippled through the assembled troops were barely audible. A collective intake of breath, a moment of frozen horror. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not now. Not in front of cameras and witnesses and 2,000 people. And then, without another word, without another moment of hesitation, Brigadier General Harrison Pierce raised his weapon and fired 5 rounds directly at the ground near Captain Hartwell's feet. The shots cracked out across the training ground like thunder. Dust erupted. The impact threw rocks and dirt into the air. The sound was deafening, the kind of sound that makes your bones vibrate and your instincts scream at you to run, to hide, to do anything but stand still. But Captain Adrian Hartwell didn't move. Brigadier General Harrison Pierce was not a man who had arrived at his position through luck or accident. He was a product of the old guard, a military institution that had been shaped by decades of tradition, hierarchy, and an unshakable belief in the chain of command. At 58 years old, with 32 years of active military service, he had climbed the ranks methodically, deliberately, and with a reputation that preceded him like a shadow. But the reputation wasn't one of inspiration or leadership. It was one of control. His career had been marked by competence in logistics and tactical operations. He could organize a complex military movement with the precision of a master chess player. He could read a map, understand supply chains, and coordinate movements across vast distances. These skills had made him valuable. These skills had made him promotable. But they had also isolated him in a particular mindset, one where results were what mattered, and the methods used to achieve those results were secondary concerns. Pierce had grown up in a different era of military culture, the 70s and 80s, a time when respect was demanded through fear rather than earned through leadership, a time when questioning a superior officer was considered a career-ending move, a time when the ranks were almost exclusively male, and the idea of women serving in command positions was treated as a novelty at best and a threat at worst. Those values had calcified in him. They had become the bedrock of his worldview. Over the years, Pierce had been passed over for higher promotion several times. Major general positions had gone to officers younger than him, officers who had better interpersonal skills, officers who understood that modern military leadership required more than just issuing orders. That stung him. That had created a bitterness that he carried like a weight. He had compensated for this disappointment by becoming increasingly rigid, increasingly authoritarian, increasingly focused on control as a substitute for respect. At Fort Ridgemont, Pierce ruled with an iron fist. His staff feared him. His subordinates moved quickly when he entered a room. His decisions were rarely questioned because people had learned, through years of observation, that questioning Brigadier General Pierce came with consequences. Career consequences. Social consequences. The kind of consequences that made military life unbearable for anyone foolish enough to challenge him. But there was something else about Pierce that made him particularly dangerous in this moment. It wasn't just his age or his outdated worldview. It was his fragility. Despite the display of authority, despite the imposing presence and the commanding voice, Brigadier General Harrison Pierce was a fragile man. His confidence was brittle. His ego was thin. and his position, which he had fought so hard to maintain, was beginning to feel precarious in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The military was changing. Younger officers were coming up through the ranks with different values. Women were moving into positions of responsibility and competence. Diversity initiatives were being implemented. Merit-based promotions were becoming more common. These changes, which represented progress to most of the institution, felt like threats to Pierce. They felt like erosion. They felt like the world he had built his entire identity around was crumbling beneath his feet. So when Captain Adrian Hartwell, a competent, respected, highly capable woman, had the audacity to interrupt his exercise, to question his judgment, to imply that his planning was flawed in front of witnesses, she had done something far more dangerous than she realized. She had challenged not just his authority in that moment, but the entire foundation of his self-image. She had suggested that he was fallible, that he could make mistakes, that his judgment could be questioned. In that moment, standing in the desert heat with 2,000 troops watching, Brigadier General Harrison Pierce didn't see a trauma surgeon trying to prevent a tragedy. He saw a symbol of everything he feared. He saw the changing military. He saw his own irrelevance. He saw a woman stepping out of her place and threatening the order he had spent his entire life maintaining. And that's what made him reach for his weapon. The 5 shots he fired weren't really aimed at the ground. They were aimed at reasserting dominance. They were aimed at reminding everyone present, including himself, that he was still in control, that his authority was still absolute, that no one, especially not a woman, could challenge him without consequences. What Pierce didn't realize, in that moment of rage and fear and desperation, was that everything had changed. The world he was trying to preserve was already gone. The military he remembered no longer existed, and his own actions, captured on multiple cameras, witnessed by 2,000 people, and now etched into the consciousness of every person present, had just sealed his fate. But he would learn that soon enough. Captain Adrian Hartwell's path to this moment had been carved by discipline, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to a principle that most people only understood in theory: the Hippocratic Oath. For her, those words weren't just a ceremonial recitation spoken at graduation. They were a living, breathing code that governed every decision she made, every risk she took, and every time she chose to speak up even when silence would have been easier. She had grown up in Portland, Oregon, in a middle-class household where education was treated as a pathway to freedom and responsibility. Her father had been a civil engineer, her mother a high school mathematics teacher. Neither had come from money or privilege, but both had instilled in their 3 children a fierce belief in excellence and integrity. Adrian was the oldest. From childhood, she had been drawn to medicine, not the prestige of it, but the purpose. The idea that you could spend your life actually making a difference in someone else's existence. She had attended the University of Washington on a merit scholarship, excelling in her pre-med courses while working part-time at a local hospital to pay for housing and living expenses. During those years, she had witnessed medicine from both sides, the clinical side in classes and labs, and the human side in hospital corridors where real people faced real suffering. She had decided, during a rotation in the emergency department in her 3rd year, that she wanted to specialize in trauma surgery. Not emergency room work, though that was important. She wanted to handle the worst-case scenarios, the cases where seconds mattered, the cases where a surgeon's skill and composure could literally be the difference between someone walking out of a hospital and being carried out in a body bag. Medical school at Johns Hopkins had been rigorous and transformative. She had graduated in the top 10% of her class. Her residency in trauma surgery at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle had exposed her to the most challenging cases in the Pacific Northwest. By the time she completed her fellowship, she had performed over 2,000 surgical procedures and had personally trained dozens of younger surgeons in the principles of damage control surgery, the art and science of saving lives when every second counts. But Adrian had made a choice that surprised many of her colleagues. At 32 years old, with a promising civilian career ahead of her, with the kind of reputation that would have opened doors at prestigious hospitals across the country, she had enlisted in the United States Army Medical Corps. Not as a reserve officer, not as a weekend warrior, but as a full-time, active-duty trauma surgeon committed to serving wherever her country needed her. Her colleagues had questioned the decision. Why would you trade a six-figure civilian salary, academic prestige, and the comforts of American medicine for military life? The answer, for Adrienne, had been simple. Because that's where the need was greatest. Because soldiers deserved the same level of surgical excellence that wealthy civilians received. Because she had spent her entire career preparing to handle trauma, and she wanted to do that work where it mattered most. In combat zones, in field hospitals, in situations where the stakes were literally life and death. Her first deployment had been to Afghanistan in 2011. She had been terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. She had arrived at Bagram Airfield and been immediately thrown into the reality of military medicine, a reality far different from the controlled environments of American hospitals. Casualties came in without warning. Resources were limited. The standard protocols of civilian medicine had to be adapted to work with what was available. And the psychological weight of knowing that the people coming through your surgical tent were there because of combat, because of war, because of decisions made far above your pay grade, that weight was something no training program could fully prepare you for. Over her next 14 years, Adrienne had served 3 combat deployments. She had been stationed in Iraq, Afghanistan, and had spent time deployed to forward operating bases where the line between safety and danger was measured in meters. She had performed surgery in tents during sandstorms. She had worked through the night with limited blood supplies. She had made impossible decisions about who could be saved and who couldn't. And through all of it, she had maintained her commitment to excellence and integrity. Her reputation throughout the military medical community was stellar. Surgeons who had trained under her spoke about her with reverence. Officers who had worked with her cited her judgment and composure as examples of what military medicine should be. She had been promoted to captain, then selected for the position of chief medical officer of her battalion, a position that reflected both her surgical expertise and her leadership abilities. But more importantly, Adrienne had never forgotten why she joined the military in the first place. She was there to save lives. Not to advance her career, though that had happened. Not to gain prestige, though that had come. She was there because she believed that every soldier, every person under her care, deserved to have someone in the medical chain who would advocate for their safety, who would speak up when something was wrong, and who would never, ever compromise on the principles that kept people alive. That belief had carried her through 14 years of service. It had sustained her through difficult decisions and complex situations. And it was that belief that had compelled her, on that afternoon at Fort Ridgemont, to walk up to Lieutenant Commander Walsh and point out a safety hazard that could have killed people. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. She had done it because lives were at stake. She had done it because she was a doctor first and everything else, rank, politics, career, came second. She had no idea that this single act of integrity was about to change everything. The afternoon had started like any other major military exercise at Fort Ridgemont. The temperature was climbing toward 95 degrees, and the Nevada sun beat down on the training ground with the kind of relentless intensity that made the air shimmer and distort. Captain Hartwell had been awake since 4 in the morning, reviewing the day's operational schedule, checking medical supplies, and ensuring that her team of 47 medical personnel were properly briefed on their roles in the exercise. The 847th Combat Support Battalion's live-fire exercise was designed to test the unit's ability to respond to a mass casualty scenario in a simulated combat environment. The scenario was realistic. A convoy had been ambushed, multiple vehicles had been damaged, and there were approximately 80 simulated casualties that needed to be triaged, treated, and evacuated. The exercise would test communication protocols, supply chain management, coordination between medical teams, and the ability of leadership to make decisions under pressure. On paper, it was a well-designed training operation. The exercise coordinators, a team of experienced officers who specialized in designing realistic military training scenarios, had spent weeks planning every detail. The terrain had been selected to provide natural cover and realistic obstacles. The casualty scenarios had been created to test specific medical decision-making skills. The timeline had been structured to build progressively more complex challenges as the exercise moved forward. Captain Hartwell's role was to oversee the medical response. She had positioned herself near the forward operating base, a hastily constructed medical treatment facility made up of 3 large canvas tents connected by covered walkways. Inside these tents, her surgical team, nursing staff, and medical technicians would receive the simulated casualties, perform initial assessments, provide emergency treatment, and prepare patients for evacuation via helicopter. The first 2 hours of the exercise had proceeded smoothly. Casualties arrived in waves, her team triaged them efficiently, treatment protocols were executed flawlessly, and the coordination between ground medical personnel and the Evacuation Coordination Center worked without significant problems. Brigadier General Pierce had been moving through the exercise area, observing operations and making notes. He seemed satisfied with how things were progressing. Captain Hartwell had noticed him stopping to watch her surgical team work, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. It was during the 3rd phase of the exercise, approximately 3 hours into the operation, that Captain Hartwell had been standing near the medical tent's entrance when she observed the exercise coordinators beginning to set up for the helicopter evacuation scenario. This was supposed to be the climactic phase of the exercise, a realistic simulation of how casualties would be transported from the forward operating base to the main medical facility at the base hospital. A Black Hawk helicopter had been scheduled to land in a designated zone approximately 200 meters from the medical tents. The plan was for medical personnel to load the most critically injured simulated casualties onto the aircraft. The pilot would execute a takeoff, and then the aircraft would circle back and land again to pick up additional patients. It was a standard evacuation procedure, the kind that happened regularly in real combat operations. But as Captain Hartwell watched the exercise coordinators marking off the landing zone with bright orange cones and safety markers, something caught her attention: the wind. Throughout the morning, the wind had been relatively calm, shifting occasionally but nothing significant. But in the past 30 minutes, the wind patterns had changed. A thermal updraft was creating a phenomenon that was common in the Nevada desert. A swirling vortex of hot air that was moving across the training ground in an unpredictable pattern. She had seen the effect immediately in the dust and debris that was being kicked up across the training area. Light objects were being caught in the wind currents and swept in circular patterns. The visibility was decreasing noticeably. And most concerning, the wind vortex seemed to be tracking directly toward the area where the helicopter landing zone had been marked. Captain Hartwell had trained extensively in combat medicine, including multiple deployments where she had worked in forward operating bases that received regular helicopter traffic. She knew the dangers intimately. She had seen what happened when a helicopter encountered unexpected wind shear during landing operations. She had treated the victims of rotor blade strikes. She had held the hands of soldiers who had lost limbs because of accidents that could have been prevented with proper safety protocols. In Kandahar in 2019, she had witnessed firsthand what poor landing zone planning could result in. A Black Hawk had come in to evacuate casualties from a small forward operating base. The pilot had misjudged the wind conditions, the aircraft had drifted slightly, and the rear rotor blade had caught the corner of a medical tent. The impact had been catastrophic. 3 medical personnel had been killed instantly. 2 soldiers had sustained injuries so severe that they had been medically evacuated and discharged from the military with permanent disabilities. Captain Hartwell had been in the tent when it happened. She had heard the sound of the blades striking canvas and metal. She had seen the chaos that followed. That memory had stayed with her for 5 years. It had haunted her. It had shaped her approach to safety protocols. And when she saw the landing zone being set up in conditions that were eerily similar to that day in Afghanistan, something inside her crystallized into absolute clarity. This couldn't happen again. Not on her watch. Not when she could prevent it. She had looked at the orange cones marking the landing zone. She had watched the wind continuing to swirl and gust across the training area. She had checked the wind speed indicator that was part of the exercise equipment, and the readings were showing increasingly variable conditions. The safety margins that should have existed around the landing zone were being eroded by the changing atmospheric conditions. Without hesitation, without overthinking it, Captain Hartwell had walked directly toward Lieutenant Commander Walsh, the senior exercise coordinator. Her mind was calm. Her purpose was clear. She had spent her entire career preparing for moments like this, moments where speaking up, even when it was uncomfortable, could save lives. She had no idea that this simple act of professional responsibility was about to trigger a chain of events that would shake the entire battalion. Lieutenant Commander James Walsh had been coordinating military exercises for over 12 years. He had worked on small training operations with 50 personnel and massive battalion-level exercises with thousands of troops. He understood the complexity of designing realistic scenarios while maintaining acceptable safety margins. He had the kind of experience that made him valuable to the military training infrastructure, the ability to create challenging conditions that tested soldiers' skills without crossing the line into genuine danger. That afternoon at Fort Ridgemont, Walsh had been moving between various positions across the training ground, monitoring the exercise's progress, making real-time adjustments to the scenario as needed, and communicating with the senior leadership, primarily Brigadier General Pierce, about how the operation was proceeding. So far, everything had gone according to plan. The medical team had performed excellently. The logistical support had been seamless. The communication protocols had worked effectively. It was, by any standard, a successful exercise. Walsh was standing near the helicopter landing zone, reviewing the positioning of the safety equipment with his junior coordinators, when he noticed Captain Hartwell approaching. He recognized her immediately. Over the past several months, since Captain Hartwell had assumed her role as Chief Medical Officer, he had interacted with her multiple times during planning meetings and pre-exercise briefings. He had been impressed by her professionalism, her detailed knowledge of medical protocols, and her thoughtful approach to problem-solving. He had also noticed something else about her, something that he suspected few others had consciously registered. She was careful, meticulous, the kind of officer who asked good questions during briefings, who reviewed documentation thoroughly, and who seemed to genuinely care about the details rather than just going through the motions. So when Captain Hartwell walked up to him with a calm but purposeful expression, Walsh had instinctively sensed that this wasn't a casual conversation. She had something specific on her mind. "Lieutenant Commander," she had said, keeping her voice level and professional, "may I speak with you privately for a moment?" Walsh had nodded and stepped away from his junior coordinators, creating a small bubble of privacy in the midst of the organized chaos of the exercise. Captain Hartwell had explained, with precise clarity and without any sense of alarm or drama, what she had observed. The wind patterns, the changing atmospheric conditions, the way the thermal updraft was affecting the visibility and creating unpredictable air currents in the landing zone. She had pointed out the specific locations where she had observed the most significant wind effects. She had noted that the safety perimeter markers were positioned too close to where the rotor wash would create maximum turbulence. Most importantly, she had explained why this mattered. She had talked about the physics of helicopter landing operations. She had described the critical parameters that pilots need to maintain safe approach vectors. She had explained, in terms that were both technical and accessible, why the current landing zone positioning created an unacceptable risk. Throughout her explanation, Captain Hartwell had maintained absolute composure. She hadn't been emotional about it. She hadn't been dramatic. She had simply presented facts, analysis, and professional judgment. And she had done it all while being respectful of Walsh's authority and expertise. Walsh had listened carefully, and as he listened, he had realized that Captain Hartwell was absolutely correct. He had been so focused on the timing of the exercise and the coordination of the scenario that he had not adequately accounted for the changing weather conditions. The wind situation had developed gradually throughout the morning, and he had failed to make the necessary adjustments. Captain Hartwell had caught something that he, in his role as exercise coordinator, should have caught himself. This realization created an immediate professional dilemma for Walsh. On one hand, he had a professional responsibility to address the safety concern. That was not negotiable. Safety protocols existed for a reason, and a legitimate concern raised by a qualified officer could not be ignored. On the other hand, addressing this concern meant interrupting Brigadier General Pierce's exercise. It meant indicating to the senior leadership that the exercise coordinators had not adequately planned for environmental variables. It meant admitting that an adjustment needed to be made. Walsh knew, from his interactions with Brigadier General Pierce over the past several months, that Pierce was not the kind of officer who responded well to problems. Pierce preferred things to proceed according to plan, without complications or changes. But Walsh also knew that his professional integrity, and more importantly, the safety of the personnel involved in the exercise, had to take priority over any concerns about how the general might react. "You're right," Walsh had said to Captain Hartwell, without any hesitation. "Your assessment is sound. We need to reposition the landing zone and adjust the safety perimeter. I'll inform General Pierce immediately." It had been that simple, that straightforward. A professional officer making a professional decision based on professional judgment. What neither of them realized in that moment was that this simple, correct decision was about to create a firestorm. What neither of them understood was that Brigadier General Pierce had been looking for a reason, any reason, to assert his authority and remind everyone present who was in command. What neither of them could have predicted was that Pierce would interpret this legitimate safety correction not as a professional adjustment, but as a personal challenge to his authority. Walsh had turned to walk toward Brigadier General Pierce, intending to brief him on the safety concern and recommend the repositioning of the landing zone. He had expected Pierce to listen, to understand the logic, and to approve the adjustment. It was what any competent commander would do. Instead, what would happen next would set in motion a series of events that would test everything Captain Hartwell believed about courage, integrity, and standing up for what was right, even when the price might be far higher than she could have imagined. The moment Lieutenant Commander Walsh began walking toward Brigadier General Pierce, Captain Hartwell had remained where she was, standing near the landing zone with her hands at her sides. She had done what she came to do. She had identified a safety hazard, she had brought it to the attention of the appropriate officer, and she had provided her professional assessment. The rest was now in Walsh's hands and in the chain of command above him. She had no way of knowing that this simple act, this straightforward execution of her professional responsibility, had just set off a trigger in Brigadier General Pierce's mind that would have catastrophic consequences. Pierce had been standing approximately 100 meters away, positioned on a slight rise that gave him a commanding view of the entire exercise area. He had been observing the helicopter landing zone preparations through binoculars, watching as his coordinators made final adjustments to the safety equipment. He had been satisfied with how the exercise was progressing. In his mind, everything was proceeding according to his plan, which meant everything was proceeding correctly. He had noticed Captain Hartwell approaching Walsh, but he hadn't thought much of it initially. Officers were always communicating, always coordinating. It was a normal part of military operations. But then he had noticed something in their body language, the way Hartwell was gesturing toward the landing zone, the way Walsh was listening intently, the way the conversation seemed to be shifting from casual coordination to something more serious. Pierce had lowered his binoculars and watched more carefully. He had seen Walsh nod, acknowledge something that Hartwell had said, and then turn in Pierce's direction. In that moment, Pierce had understood what was about to happen. Someone, that woman, that medic, that officer who was not even part of the exercise coordination team, had identified something wrong with his exercise, and Walsh was about to come interrupt him to discuss it. The thought had ignited something in Pierce. Not just irritation, not just professional frustration, but something deeper. Something that touched on his deepest insecurities about his position, his authority, and his relevance in a military institution that was rapidly changing around him. Because in that moment, Pierce had made a cognitive leap that was fundamentally distorted. He had transformed what was actually a professional safety concern into something personal. He had decided, in the space of a few seconds, that this was an attempt to undermine him. That Captain Hartwell, by identifying a problem with his exercise, was attempting to make him look incompetent in front of 2,000 personnel. That this was a challenge to his authority. It was a profoundly irrational interpretation. A trauma surgeon identifying a legitimate safety hazard was not the same as undermining a general's authority. A competent exercise coordinator acknowledging a valid concern and recommending an adjustment was not the same as questioning a commander's judgment. These were normal, routine aspects of military operations, the kind of professional communication that happened constantly in well-functioning military units. But Brigadier General Pierce was not thinking rationally in that moment. He was thinking emotionally. He was thinking about all the ways that he felt his position had been eroded, all the promotions he had been passed over for, all the younger officers who seemed to have easier paths to advancement, all the women who were moving into positions of responsibility in an institution that, in his mind, had always been a male domain. And now, on a training ground in the Nevada desert with 2,000 troops present and cameras rolling, a woman had just interrupted his exercise to point out a flaw in his planning. It was, in Pierce's mind, intolerable. It was a line that could not be crossed without consequences. He had begun walking toward the landing zone even before Walsh reached him. His pace was deliberate. His posture was rigid. His face was already beginning to flush with anger. Other officers near him had noticed the change in his demeanor. Some had exchanged glances. A few had instinctively moved slightly out of his path, creating space for whatever was about to happen. When Walsh had seen Pierce approaching with that particular expression, he had understood immediately that something had shifted. The general's body language had changed from observational to aggressive. Walsh had continued walking toward Pierce, intending to brief him on the safety concern, but he had sensed that the dynamic was no longer simply about exercise coordination. Pierce had intercepted Walsh before he could deliver his briefing. His words had come out sharp and clipped. "What's the problem, Lieutenant Commander? Why are you abandoning your post?" Walsh had attempted to explain. He had used professional language. He had been respectful. He had presented the safety concern in clear, logical terms. "Sir, Captain Hartwell has identified a potential wind hazard in the landing zone. The thermal updrafts are creating conditions that may exceed safe parameters for helicopter operations. I recommend we reposition." But Pierce had cut him off mid-sentence. His voice had risen. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface had begun to boil over. He had asked Walsh, who had given Captain Hartwell authority to make assessments about exercise operations. He had questioned whether Walsh was competent to make decisions without Pierce's direct approval. He had made it clear, in language that was becoming increasingly hostile, that he did not appreciate having his exercise interrupted by personnel who were outside the command chain. And then, with a tone that was meant to be final, Pierce had said something that would echo across the training ground and be heard by hundreds of people. "Get back to your position, Lieutenant Commander. The exercise will proceed as planned. There are no safety concerns here, and if anyone else tries to interfere with my operations, they will answer to me directly." With those words, Pierce had turned and begun walking directly toward Captain Hartwell. She was still standing near the landing zone, waiting to see if Walsh had been able to brief the general on her concerns. She had no way of knowing what had just transpired in that brief conversation between Walsh and Pierce. She had no way of knowing that her act of professional responsibility was about to be interpreted as insubordination. She had no way of knowing that the man walking toward her with such obvious anger was about to do something that would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. All she knew was that Brigadier General Harrison Pierce was coming her way, and the expression on his face suggested that this was not going to be a pleasant conversation. Captain Hartwell saw Brigadier General Pierce approaching long before he reached her. She recognized the signs immediately: the rigid posture, the accelerated pace, the way his jaw was clenched, the flush of color rising in his neck. These were the physical manifestations of anger in its raw, unfiltered form. She had seen men angry before. She had seen soldiers enraged in combat situations. She had witnessed rage born from pain, from fear, from the desperation of life-and-death circumstances. But this was different. This was rage born from ego. And ego, she had learned over her years of military service, was often more dangerous than genuine threat. She had made a conscious decision in that moment, a decision that would define everything that followed. She would not escalate. She would not match his anger with defensiveness. She would not raise her voice or challenge his authority directly. Instead, she would stand her ground with composure and professionalism. She would meet his aggression with calm. And she would do this knowing that it might very well cost her career, her standing in the military, or worse. When Pierce reached her, he was already speaking before he fully stopped walking. His words came like accusations, sharp and cutting. He demanded to know who had authorized her to interrupt his exercise. He questioned her competence and her understanding of the chain of command. He accused her of overstepping her authority, of attempting to undermine his leadership, of embarrassing him in front of the entire battalion. His voice rose with each sentence, each word delivered with the intention to wound, to humiliate, to break down her composure. Around them, the exercise operations had begun to slow. Personnel had noticed the confrontation. Cameras that had been positioned throughout the training ground to document the exercise were continuing to roll, capturing everything that was unfolding. What had been a routine military training operation was transforming, in real time, into something far more significant. Captain Hartwell listened without interrupting. She did not defend herself. She did not explain her reasoning. She did not attempt to justify her actions. She simply stood there, her hands remaining at her sides, her breathing steady and controlled, her eyes fixed forward. To an observer, it might have appeared that she was passive or accepting the criticism without resistance. But those who knew her, those who had worked with her, would have understood that this was not passivity. This was something far more powerful. It was deliberate, intentional composure in the face of aggression. Pierce's anger seemed to grow more intense with each moment that Hartwell remained calm. Her refusal to react, her refusal to defend herself, her refusal to show fear or distress. All of this seemed to infuriate him further. In his mind, her composure was itself a form of defiance. Her calm was a challenge to his authority. Her steadiness was a silent statement that his words were not affecting her, that his anger could not break her. He continued speaking, his words becoming increasingly personal, increasingly demeaning. He made comments about her competence as a physician. He suggested that perhaps her gender had contributed to her advancement beyond her actual abilities. He implied that women simply didn't understand military operations the way men did. He stated, with absolute conviction, that she had no business questioning the decisions of a general officer, that she should focus on her medical duties and leave operational planning to people who actually understood command. As Pierce spoke, other officers began to gather at a distance. They were maintaining what could be considered appropriate military spacing, not too close, not obviously eavesdropping, but clearly present and observing. These were senior non-commissioned officers, junior officers, and mid-level commanders. They were the backbone of the military structure, the personnel who maintained unit cohesion and standards. And they were witnessing, in real time, something that violated every principle of leadership they had been trained to uphold. One of these observers was Master Sergeant David Reeves, a 28-year veteran who served as the battalion's senior enlisted advisor. Reeves had worked under 8 different commanders during his career. He had seen good leadership and poor leadership. He had witnessed commanders who inspired loyalty and commanders who ruled through fear. And he had developed, over nearly 3 decades of service, a keen eye for understanding the difference between legitimate authority and abusive authority. What he was witnessing now, in the confrontation between Brigadier General Pierce and Captain Hartwell, was a clear violation of military standards of leadership. A senior officer was publicly humiliating a subordinate for doing her job correctly. A commander was using his rank and authority not to lead effectively, but to punish and intimidate. And most significantly, Pierce was doing this in front of witnesses, in front of cameras, in a setting where everything was documented and recorded. Another observer was Captain Michael Torres, the battalion's public affairs officer. Torres had been positioned near the exercise area as part of the standard documentation process. He had a camera crew with him, and they had been recording various aspects of the exercise for the after-action review that would be conducted following the training operation. As the confrontation between Pierce and Hartwell unfolded, Torres realized that his camera was capturing something far more significant than a routine exercise. He was documenting what appeared to be a serious breach of military conduct by a senior officer. A third observer was Dr. Eleanor Chun, a civilian contractor who was observing the exercise for the Department of Defense to evaluate the effectiveness of the battalion's medical response protocols. Chun had decades of experience evaluating military operations, and she immediately recognized what was happening as deeply problematic. A qualified medical officer had identified a legitimate safety concern. That officer had followed proper channels to report the concern. And now she was being publicly berated by a senior commander for performing her professional duties correctly. Captain Hartwell remained standing through all of this. Her hands did not move. Her expression did not change. Her breathing did not become rapid or shallow. She was, to all external appearances, completely unaffected by Pierce's tirade, and this unwavering composure seemed to push Pierce toward an escalation point, a moment where anger crossed from verbal aggression into something far more dangerous. It was at this precise moment, with tensions at their absolute peak, with nearly 2,000 personnel watching and cameras recording, that Brigadier General Harrison Pierce made the decision that would define this day forever. It was a decision born from rage, from humiliation, from the desperate need to reassert dominance in a situation where he felt he was losing control. His hand moved to his hip. His fingers closed around the grip of his service weapon. The moment Brigadier General Pierce's hand moved to his service weapon, time seemed to fracture into discrete segments. What would normally take perhaps 3 seconds to execute, drawing a pistol from a holster, felt to the observers present as if it were happening in slow motion, each micro-movement magnified and distinct in consciousness. The M9 Beretta service pistol was standard issue for officers in the United States Army. It was a 9mm semi-automatic weapon, reliable and effective. Pierce had carried the same weapon for over 30 years. He knew its weight, its balance, its mechanics as intimately as he knew his own body. Drawing it was automatic, practiced, requiring no conscious thought. But the context in which he was drawing it was unprecedented. This was not a training exercise with the weapon. This was not a range qualification. This was not a combat situation where a weapon might be needed for defense or offense. This was a senior military officer, in a moment of uncontrolled rage, drawing a loaded firearm in front of 2,000 witnesses during a training operation. The first person to truly grasp what was happening was Master Sergeant Reeves. His military experience, his decades of training, and his acute observation skills allowed him to recognize the gesture immediately. He had begun moving, his body reacting before his conscious mind had fully processed what he was seeing. Several other senior non-commissioned officers had also recognized the movement, and a subtle shift had begun to ripple through the assembled personnel. A collective intake of breath, an almost imperceptible movement backward, a sudden heightening of alertness. Captain Torres, the public affairs officer, had continued recording. His camera operator, a young specialist named Jennifer Walsh, had instinctively zoomed in on the unfolding scene. They were capturing, in high-definition video, something that would become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in what was about to become a major military investigation. Dr. Eleanor Chun, the civilian contractor observing the exercise, had felt her medical training kick in. She had immediately assessed the tactical situation, identifying exits, evaluating her own position relative to potential ballistic trajectories, preparing mentally for the possibility that medical response might be required within moments. But Captain Adrian Hartwell had not moved. She had not flinched. She had not stepped backward or raised her hands or shown any visible sign of fear. When she saw Pierce's hand moving toward his weapon, when she understood that he was actually drawing the pistol, when she realized that he was about to do something that violated every military regulation and law, she had simply maintained her composure. Her mind, trained through years of trauma surgery and combat medicine, had engaged in rapid analysis. She had assessed the distance between herself and Pierce, approximately 2 meters. She had evaluated the weapon he was drawing, a 9mm Beretta. She had calculated trajectory angles and understood, from her medical training, what a weapon fired at close range could do to human tissue. And she had made a decision, in that millisecond of recognition, to remain calm and not react in ways that might provoke further escalation. The weapon cleared the holster. Pierce's arm came up. His face was contorted with rage, his breathing rapid and shallow. For the first time in this entire confrontation, his composure had completely shattered. What remained was a man in the grip of an emotion so powerful that it had overridden his judgment, his training, and his understanding of consequences. He had not pointed the weapon at Captain Hartwell's body. That fact would later become significant in the investigation. Instead, he had angled the weapon downward, toward the ground at a point approximately half a meter to the side of where she was standing. It was a deliberate choice, consciously made even in his rage, a way of asserting dominance and demonstrating his power without crossing the absolute line of attempting to murder a subordinate officer. Though in the moment, the distinction seemed entirely academic to the observers present. Pierce had pulled the trigger 5 times in rapid succession. The sound had been deafening, far louder than most people present would have expected, especially in an outdoor setting. The muzzle flashes, bright even in daylight, had been clearly visible. The impact of the 9mm rounds striking the packed earth of the training ground had kicked up visible plumes of dust and debris. The first shot had struck approximately 40 centimeters to the right of Hartwell's feet. The second had impacted slightly closer. The third and fourth had created a ragged line of impact craters moving in her direction. The fifth shot had struck less than 15 centimeters from her left boot. The psychological intention was unmistakable. Each shot was moving closer to her position, creating a literal and metaphorical demonstration of Pierce's power and his willingness to use it. It was intimidation at its most primal level. It was a commander using a weapon to assert dominance over a subordinate. The sound of the final shot echoed across the training ground and then faded into a silence that seemed to possess physical weight. The smell of cordite and burned powder drifted through the air. Dust continued to settle around the impact craters. And through it all, Captain Adrian Hartwell remained standing, unmoved, her hands still at her sides, her breathing still controlled and steady. For perhaps 3 seconds, a duration that felt far longer to everyone present, nothing happened. The entire battalion seemed to be frozen in place, each person processing what they had just witnessed. A general officer had fired a weapon at the feet of a female captain. It had happened in front of cameras. It had happened in front of 2,000 witnesses. It had happened in the middle of a documented military training exercise. It was the kind of event that shattered the normal rules of military operations. It was the kind of moment that demanded an immediate response, but a response so significant and consequential that no one was quite ready to initiate it. Master Sergeant Reeves had continued moving forward, his training and instinct compelling him toward the confrontation. Other senior officers had begun moving as well, some approaching Pierce, some moving to position themselves between Pierce and Hartwell, others moving toward the cameras and the exercise coordinators. Captain Torres had lowered his camera, though the recording continued. He had understood, in that moment, that what he had just documented was about to set off a chain of events that would transform from a training exercise into something far more serious. And Brigadier General Harrison Pierce, with the pistol still in his hand, had finally seemed to grasp, in some dim corner of his consciousness, that he had just done something from which there was no recovery. In the seconds immediately following the final gunshot, Captain Adrian Hartwell's mind had engaged in a process that trauma surgeons develop over years of practice. The ability to assess a critical situation, identify what matters most, and determine the appropriate response. She had been trained to think clearly in chaos. She had been trained to prioritize. She had been trained to act with purpose even when emotions were running high and circumstances were uncertain. The gunshots had ended. The dust was beginning to settle. Brigadier General Pierce was still holding his weapon, though his arm had begun to lower. His chest was heaving with exertion and adrenaline. His face remained flushed, but something in his expression had shifted. A dawning recognition, perhaps, of what he had just done. Captain Hartwell had made a deliberate choice in that moment. She had decided that this was not the time to show anger, to demand accountability, or to respond emotionally to what had just occurred. Those responses would be natural. Those responses would be understandable. But they would also be counterproductive. Instead, she had decided to do something far more powerful. She had decided to respond with absolute professionalism. She had calmly looked down at the churned-up earth where the rounds had impacted, observing the pattern of the bullet strikes, the scattered debris, the visible evidence of what had just transpired. Then, with a deliberate slowness that conveyed complete composure, she had raised her gaze back to Brigadier General Pierce. Her eyes had met his directly. Her breathing had remained steady. Her voice, when she spoke, had been clear and level. "Sir," she had said, her voice carrying across the now silent training ground, "this range is no longer safe for operations. You have just demonstrated a serious breach of weapons safety protocol. The exercise must be terminated immediately. The words were simple. The words were professional. But the words were also a statement of absolute fact that could not be disputed or minimized. And by delivering them with such composure, with such clarity, Captain Hartwell had accomplished something far more significant than simply stating an observation. She had reframed the entire situation. What had been, moments before, an act of intimidation and rage had become, through her response, an undeniable violation of military conduct. What had been a power play had become evidence of incompetence. What had been intended to break her had become the catalyst for the destruction of Brigadier General Pierce's authority. In the immediate aftermath of her statement, the battalion seemed to collectively exhale. The paralysis that had gripped everyone present seemed to break. Officers began moving with purpose and clarity. Master Sergeant Reeves had moved directly toward Brigadier General Pierce, his veteran's presence commanding authority through force of personality rather than rank. Other senior non-commissioned officers had positioned themselves strategically around the training ground, their presence serving to stabilize the situation and prevent further escalation. Captain Michael Torres, the public affairs officer, had immediately understood the significance of what he had witnessed and documented. He had lowered his camera and had begun moving toward the exercise coordinator station, his mind already processing the implications of the footage he had just captured. The video evidence was clear, undeniable, and would become the central piece of documentation in what was about to become a formal military investigation. Dr. Eleanor Chun, the civilian contractor, had made a rapid assessment of the medical situation. While no one had been physically injured by the gunfire, the rounds had impacted the ground rather than human targets. The psychological and operational impact was severe. She had immediately begun moving toward Captain Hartwell, both to ensure her well-being and to position herself as a witness to what had occurred. What happened next unfolded with the kind of methodical precision that characterizes the military response to serious incidents. Within moments, senior officers from the battalion's command staff had arrived at the confrontation site. These were experienced commanders, colonels and majors who understood the gravity of what had occurred and who recognized that immediate, decisive action was required. One of these officers was Colonel Sarah Mendez, the battalion's operations officer and one of the most respected senior leaders in the unit. Mendez had been positioned on the opposite side of the training ground when the incident occurred, but she had immediately moved toward the scene upon hearing the gunshots. She had years of experience in command positions, and she had the kind of authority that came from competence and integrity rather than rank alone. Colonel Mendez had assessed the situation in seconds. She had recognized that Brigadier General Pierce was still holding a loaded weapon. She had understood that he was in an emotional state that made his judgment unreliable. And she had taken immediate action to ensure the safety of everyone present. She had approached Pierce directly, her voice calm but commanding, and had requested that he surrender his weapon to her. Pierce, in that moment, seemed to comprehend the full scope of what had occurred. The rage that had animated him seemed to drain away, replaced by something closer to shock or disbelief. He had handed the weapon to Colonel Mendez without resistance. What followed was a series of actions that unfolded with military precision. Medical personnel had been called to the scene, not because anyone required immediate medical attention, but because protocol demanded a medical assessment of all parties involved in a critical incident. Captain Hartwell had been approached by medical personnel, assessed for any signs of shock or injury, and informed that she would be escorted to the battalion aid station for a comprehensive evaluation. Military police had begun to arrive at the training ground. A perimeter had been established around the incident site. Personnel had been instructed to remain in place and prepare to provide statements. The camera footage from multiple sources had been immediately secured as evidence. Lieutenant Commander Walsh had been located and briefed on what had occurred. His expression had reflected a mixture of vindication and concern. Vindication because Captain Hartwell's assessment of the safety hazard had been completely correct, and concern because the situation had escalated in a way that no one could have anticipated. Captain Hartwell had remained composed throughout all of this. She had cooperated fully with medical personnel. She had prepared to provide her formal statement to military police. She had not spoken to other personnel beyond what was professionally necessary. She had simply allowed the system to function as it was designed to function. In her mind, she had done what she was trained to do. She had identified a safety hazard. She had reported it through proper channels. She had maintained her composure when confronted with aggression. And she had responded, in the critical moment, with professionalism and clarity. The rest, the investigation, the consequences, the impact on her career, was now in the hands of the military justice system. The military justice system, when activated in response to serious incidents, operates with a combination of thoroughness and efficiency that can seem at odds with civilian legal processes. Within hours of the incident at Fort Ridgemont, a formal investigation had been initiated. Within the first 24 hours, preliminary statements had been collected from over 300 witnesses. Within 48 hours, the video evidence had been reviewed, documented, and placed into the official record. And within 72 hours, the decision had been made regarding Brigadier General Harrison Pierce's immediate status. The investigation itself had been straightforward from an evidentiary standpoint. There was video documentation from multiple angles. There were hundreds of witnesses who had directly observed the incident. There were expert analyses of the weapon's discharge patterns. There was testimony from military officers who understood the gravity of what had occurred. And there was the undeniable fact that a senior officer had deliberately discharged a loaded firearm in a dangerous and unprovoked manner. What had complicated the investigation somewhat was the question of intent. Had Brigadier General Pierce intended to kill or seriously injure Captain Hartwell? The evidence suggested not. The weapon had been discharged at the ground rather than at her body. The rounds had been spaced in a pattern that seemed designed to intimidate rather than to execute. But in military law, as in most legal systems, the intent to intimidate through use of a weapon, the reckless discharge of a firearm in a populated area, and the violation of weapons safety protocols were serious charges in their own right. The investigation had also examined the events leading up to the incident. It had documented the fact that Captain Hartwell had followed proper protocol in identifying a safety concern. It had confirmed that Lieutenant Commander Walsh had acted appropriately in planning to report that concern to his superior officer. It had established that Brigadier General Pierce's reaction had been disproportionate and unjustified. And it had concluded that Pierce's conduct violated multiple military regulations and standards of leadership. The impact of the investigation had been swift and consequential for Pierce. Within 72 hours of the incident, he had been relieved of his command. This was not a suspension. This was not a temporary measure pending the outcome of legal proceedings. This was a permanent removal from the position of authority he had held. A replacement commander had been appointed to take control of the battalion effective immediately. Furthermore, Pierce had been informed that he was being referred for formal court-martial proceedings. The charges would include reckless endangerment, violation of weapons safety protocols, conduct unbecoming an officer, and abuse of authority. These were serious charges that could result in significant penalties, including imprisonment, if a court-martial found him guilty. Additionally, Pierce had been placed on immediate suspension from active duty, pending the outcome of the court-martial. He had been informed that his security clearances were being revoked. His access to military facilities and systems had been terminated. His official duties had been assumed by junior officers. In essence, Brigadier General Harrison Pierce had been systematically removed from any position of authority or influence within the military structure. The decision to move forward with court-martial proceedings had been made at the highest levels of the command structure. General Michael Rodriguez, the commanding general of the entire division that oversaw Fort Ridgemont, had personally reviewed the investigation findings. General Rodriguez had spent over 35 years in the military, and he had made it clear that he viewed Pierce's conduct as unacceptable and requiring the most serious response available. In his statement to the media and to military personnel, General Rodriguez had been direct and unambiguous. He had stated that the military could not tolerate leaders who used weapons to intimidate subordinates. He had emphasized that leadership required integrity, judgment, and the ability to manage emotions and authority responsibly. He had made it clear that Pierce's conduct fell far short of these standards. What had been particularly significant was General Rodriguez's public acknowledgement of Captain Hartwell's conduct. In his official statement, Rodriguez had specifically noted that Captain Hartwell had performed her duties correctly in identifying and reporting a safety concern. He had praised her professionalism and composure in the face of intimidation, and he had made it abundantly clear that Hartwell had done nothing wrong, and that the investigation had fully exonerated her of any misconduct. This public statement from the highest levels of command had been crucial. It had served to protect Hartwell from any potential retaliation. It had established in the official record that her actions had been appropriate and professional, and it had signaled to the entire military structure that officers who stand up for safety, who follow proper protocols, and who maintain professional integrity would be supported and protected by command. The media coverage of the incident had been extensive and substantive. News outlets had reported on the basic facts of what had occurred. They had covered the investigation findings. They had documented Pierce's relief from command and the initiation of court-martial proceedings. But perhaps more importantly, the media had begun to tell the story of Captain Hartwell, the trauma surgeon who had identified a safety hazard, who had followed protocol, who had remained composed in the face of intimidation, and who had responded with professionalism when a senior officer had discharged a weapon at her feet. Within days, the story had spread beyond military circles into broader media coverage. News anchors had interviewed military analysts and experts in leadership. Editorial pieces had been written about the importance of maintaining standards in military leadership. Social media had been filled with commentary, much of it expressing admiration for Hartwell's composure and criticism of Pierce's conduct. But perhaps most significantly, the story had resonated within the military community itself. Officers throughout the division, throughout the larger command structure, had begun to discuss what had occurred. And in those discussions, a narrative had emerged, not of a general who had lost control, though that was true, but of a system that had functioned appropriately in response to misconduct. A system where protocol mattered, where safety concerns were taken seriously, where officers who did the right thing were protected and supported. Captain Hartwell had requested, and been granted, additional leave following the incident. She had used that time to process what had occurred, to spend time with her family, and to reflect on her continued service in the military. She had been assured by her chain of command that her career would not be negatively impacted by her role in this incident. To the contrary, she had been informed that she was being considered for promotion and for expanded responsibilities within the battalion's medical command structure. But Hartwell had not requested the attention, had not sought the accolades, and had not positioned herself as any kind of hero or symbol. She had simply done her job. She had identified a problem. She had reported it through proper channels. She had remained professional when confronted with aggression. And she had responded appropriately when the situation escalated. 3 weeks after the incident at Fort Ridgemont, the 847th Combat Support Battalion had resumed normal operations under the command of Colonel James Whitmore, an experienced officer with a reputation for thoughtful leadership and genuine respect for his personnel. The training ground where the incident had occurred had been restored to its normal state. The exercise equipment had been cleared away. The impact craters from the gunshots had been smoothed over, and the battalion had begun the process of moving forward, carrying with it the lessons learned from what had transpired. Captain Adrian Hartwell had returned to her duties as Chief Medical Officer. She had resumed her regular schedule, her medical responsibilities, her oversight of the battalion's trauma response protocols. She had not given interviews to the media. She had not sought out attention or recognition. She had simply returned to work with the same quiet professionalism that had always characterized her approach to her position. But something had fundamentally changed within the battalion culture. The incident had become a touchstone, a reference point for conversations about leadership, about accountability, about the importance of speaking up when something is wrong. In the weeks following the incident, Colonel Whitmore had instituted a series of leadership forums where senior officers and non-commissioned officers had engaged in discussions about command philosophy, about the standards that defined effective leadership, and about the kind of unit culture that promoted safety and integrity. These forums had not been heavy-handed or accusatory. They had not been designed to attack or criticize Brigadier General Pierce, though his conduct was certainly discussed in the context of what not to do. Instead, they had been focused on building a positive vision of what leadership should look like. Officers had been asked to reflect on the qualities they admired in their leaders. Non-commissioned officers had been invited to share their perspectives on what distinguished commanders who inspired loyalty from those who ruled through fear. The consistent theme that had emerged from these discussions was that the most effective leaders were those who listened, who admitted mistakes, who supported their personnel in doing the right thing, and who understood that authority derived its legitimacy from integrity rather than from rank alone. Master Sergeant David Reeves, the battalion's senior enlisted advisor, had become something of an unofficial spokesperson for this emerging unit philosophy. Reeves had been through enough military upheaval to understand its significance, and he had begun to informally mentor younger officers and non-commissioned officers about the importance of standing up for what was right. He had used the incident at Fort Ridgemont as a case study in what happens when leaders lose sight of their fundamental responsibilities. In conversations with junior officers, Reeves had emphasized a simple principle. If you see something wrong, you have an obligation to report it. And if you report it properly, through the right channels, with the right attitude, and with good intentions, you will be supported. That's what happened with Captain Hartwell. She did her job. She did it right. And the system protected her. That's how it's supposed to work. Captain Michael Torres, the public affairs officer, had been approached by several media outlets requesting interviews with Captain Hartwell or asking for permission to visit the battalion to document the ongoing story. Torres had consulted with Hartwell about these requests, and she had politely declined all of them. She had explained that she did not believe the incident was about her, and that publicity would not serve any constructive purpose. Torres had respected her decision and had channeled media inquiries toward Colonel Whitmore, who had been willing to discuss the incident in broader terms related to military leadership and standards. Dr. Eleanor Chun, the civilian contractor who had observed the entire incident, had completed her evaluation of the battalion's medical response protocols. Her report, submitted to the Department of Defense, had included a detailed account of the incident and her assessment of how the battalion's medical personnel had responded to a serious crisis situation. Chun had been unsparing in her criticism of Brigadier General Pierce's conduct, but she had been equally emphatic in her praise for Captain Hartwell's professionalism and composure. Chen's report had concluded with the following assessment. Captain Hartwell demonstrated the highest standards of military professionalism in a situation that would have challenged even the most experienced officers. Her ability to maintain composure, to prioritize safety over personal security, and to respond with clarity and purpose when faced with intimidation represents an exemplary model of what military leadership should aspire to be. The 847th Combat Support Battalion is fortunate to have an officer of her caliber in a position of medical responsibility. The court-martial proceedings against Brigadier General Pierce had begun approximately 6 weeks after the incident. The trial had been conducted in a military courtroom at Fort Carson, Colorado, and had lasted 4 days. The prosecution had presented the video evidence, witness testimony, and expert analysis of the weapon's discharge patterns. The defense had attempted to argue that Pierce had been under extraordinary stress and had not intended to cause harm, but this argument had carried little weight against the overwhelming evidence of deliberate misconduct. The verdict had come quickly. Pierce had been found guilty on 3 of the 4 charges: reckless endangerment, violation of weapons safety protocols, and conduct unbecoming an officer. He had been acquitted on the most serious charge, abuse of authority, though the other convictions had been sufficient to result in significant consequences. Pierce had been sentenced to 18 months of confinement in a military prison, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and dishonorable discharge from the United States Army. The dishonorable discharge was the most severe punishment available in the military justice system short of execution. It was the military equivalent of a felony conviction and would follow Pierce for the rest of his life, limiting his employment prospects and marking him permanently as someone who had been dismissed from military service for serious misconduct. As for Captain Hartwell, her career had taken a positive trajectory following the incident. 6 months after the incident, she had been promoted to major. 8 months after the incident, she had been selected for a position as the Deputy Commander of Medical Operations for the entire division. The trajectory suggested that her career would continue to advance, that her competence and integrity would continue to be recognized and rewarded, and that she would continue to have opportunities to influence military medicine and leadership at higher levels of the institution. But what mattered most to Hartwell, what she would later reflect on as the true significance of what had occurred, was not her own advancement. It was the knowledge that she had stood for something that mattered. She had seen a problem. She had reported it appropriately. She had faced aggression and intimidation with composure. And she had emerged from the experience not broken or diminished, but strengthened by the knowledge that doing the right thing, even when it was difficult, even when it came at personal cost, was always the correct choice. Months later, when she would occasionally be approached by other officers or medical personnel who wanted to discuss what had happened, Hartwell would consistently redirect the conversation away from her own actions and toward the broader principles at stake. She would emphasize that what she had done was simply her job. She would stress that safety protocols existed for a reason. She would explain that speaking up, when done respectfully and through proper channels, was not an act of defiance but an act of responsibility. She would often conclude these conversations with a simple statement that reflected her core philosophy. The real strength in military service isn't about rank or authority or winning confrontations. It's about integrity. It's about doing what's right even when no one is watching, and especially when everyone is watching. That's what separates good leaders from the rest. And in the months and years that followed, this principle, this emphasis on integrity over ego, on safety over authority, on doing the right thing regardless of personal cost, began to permeate the culture of the 847th Combat Support Battalion. New officers joining the unit would hear the story, not as gossip or drama, but as a foundational narrative about what the battalion stood for. And they would understand, from that story, that this was a unit that valued competence, that supported personnel who did their jobs professionally, and that held its leaders accountable to the highest standards of conduct. Captain Adrian Hartwell had not sought to be a symbol or an inspiration. But by doing her job with integrity and composure when facing one of the most challenging situations a military officer could encounter, she had become exactly that. Not through seeking recognition, but through simply refusing to compromise on what was right. And that, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.